Trusting that God is in control is one of the most powerful, life-altering beliefs a person can hold. It transforms the way we live, breathe, and move in this world. It is a confidence that cannot be easily shaken, a faith rooted deep in the soul, anchoring us when the storms of life come crashing against us. Today, as I speak to you, let these words sink into the deepest parts of your heart and soul, nourishing you like fresh water to a parched land. We live in a world that is loud, filled with confusion, chaos, and voices clamoring for our attention. Each day, there are uncertainties waiting to greet us, worries that try to lay claim to our peace, and doubts that whisper when no one else is around. But amidst all this noise, there is a gentle, unwavering truth that must rise above all else: God is in control. This is not just a saying or a comforting phrase thrown around when times get tough. It is a reality that we, as believers, are invited to live by day, moment by moment. You see, trust is not something that is given, it is built. And trust in God, the one who spoke the universe into being, is no different. To trust that God is in control, we must first know who He is. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 55 verses 8 and 9, it is written, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways and my thoughts than your thoughts." This passage reminds us that God's perspective is so much greater than ours. What may seem uncertain to us is never uncertain to Him. He stands outside of time, seeing the beginning and the end as one, weaving every detail of our lives into a grand masterpiece that we cannot yet fully see. There was once a man who was going through the most difficult season of his life. Let me share his story, one that resonates deeply because it could be my story, your story, or the story of anyone who has walked through pain. This man had lost his job, faced betrayal from those he trusted, and watched as the plans he had built so carefully unraveled before his eyes. Nights were long, and prayers felt unanswered. Have you been there? In the dark where it seems as if God is silent. Yet, it was during those moments, when he had nothing left, that he found himself whispering the words, "Lord, I do not understand, but I trust that you are in control." And it was there, in the silence, that peace beyond understanding began to take root in his heart. This trust is not passive, it is active. It is choosing to believe that God's goodness and power are at work even when we do not see it. In Proverbs chapter 3 verses 5 and 6, we are called to trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. Notice what it says, with all your heart. Trust is not halfway, it is not holding on to just enough faith to get by. No, it is a full surrender, an acknowledgement that even when our understanding fails, God's wisdom prevails. Think about the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. Here was a young man who had dreams of greatness, dreams that seemed to vanish when he was thrown into a pit by his own brothers and sold into slavery. It is hard to imagine how Joseph must have felt when he was falsely accused and thrown into prison. Was he tempted to doubt? Perhaps. Did he question why his life was so full of betrayal and loss? Most likely. Yet, through it all, Joseph held on to the belief that God was in control. And in the end, he could say to his brothers in Genesis chapter 50 verse 20, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today." God's hand was at work even in the darkest moments of Joseph's life, orchestrating every event for a purpose far greater than Joseph could have ever imagined. This is the kind of trust that we are called to. It is a trust that does not waver when circumstances change, but instead clings tighter to the promises of God. In Psalm chapter 46 verse 10, the psalmist writes, "Be still, and know that I am God." There is power in stillness, in the quiet surrender that comes when we let go of trying to control every aspect of our lives and instead choose to rest in the assurance that God is sovereign. Being still does not mean we stop working or caring. It means we stop worrying and striving as if everything depends on us. It is a pause, a deep breath, and a recognition that the Creator of all things holds us in His hands. And what about Jesus, our perfect example of trust? When He was in the Garden of Gethsemane, facing the most excruciating path any human could walk, He prayed, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me." Nevertheless, not my will, but yours, be done. Luke chapter 22 verse 42. Even in his anguish, he chose to trust the Father's plan. Jesus knew that the pain of the cross was not the end, it was the path to victory, to the redemption of all humanity. If our Savior, who faced death itself, trusted the Father's plan, how much more should we trust Him in our daily trials? I remember a story from my own life that taught me the depth of this truth. There was a time when I was burdened by a situation I could not change. I had prayed fervently, asking God for intervention, hoping for a miracle. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and still, nothing seemed to move. It was during one of those long, sleepless nights that I found myself reading Psalm chapter 37 verse 7, which says, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for Him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes." The words, "wait patiently," struck me. Trust was not just believing that God was in control, it was being willing to wait for His timing without losing hope. In that moment, I realized that trust was not just for the outcome, it was for the journey. It was for those days when the answer had not yet come, when the breakthrough was still on the horizon. It was in those moments of waiting that my faith grew stronger, roots digging deep into the soil of God's promises. I learned that God's silence is not His absence, and His timing is not our timing. He is never late. Just as the Israelites stood before the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army closing in, it seemed that all hope was lost. Yet, in that very moment of desperation, God spoke to Moses and said in Exodus chapter 14 verse 14, "The Lord will fight for you, you need only to be still." Dear friend, wherever you are right now, know this, God is fighting for you. He is not a distant deity, unmoved by our struggles. He is our Father, close and compassionate, involved in every detail of our lives. In Romans chapter 8 verse 28, Paul assures us, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." All things, yes, even the hard things, the confusing things, the moments that break our hearts. He is weaving them together for good. You may be asking, but what if I do not see the good? Oh, I understand that question, because life does not always reveal the reason behind every hardship. Sometimes, trust means choosing to believe that one day, when we look back from the other side of eternity, we will see that every tear, every trial, was part of a divine plan. It is the kind of trust that says, I may not see it now, but I believe that God is writing a story of redemption, even here, even now. I want to share with you the story of a woman named Juan, who faced a battle that tested her faith like never before. She was diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, and the prognosis was not good. Doctors spoke words that shook her to the core, and fear came knocking at her door. But Juan had a faith that was fierce. She chose to speak God's promises over her life, declaring aloud the words of Psalm chapter 23 verse 4, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me." In the days that followed, Juan's trust in God became a lifeline, anchoring her in the storm. The treatments were grueling, and there were days when she felt as if she could not go on. But in those moments, she would remind herself, "God, you are with me. You have not brought me this far to leave me now." Friends, that is what trust looks like. It is holding on when everything in you wants to let go, choosing to believe that the same God who parted the Red Sea and raised Lazarus from the dead is working in your situation. There were countless nights when Juan would wake up, her heart racing, fear creeping in like an unwelcome guest. But instead of allowing fear to have the final word, she would whisper the words of Philippians chapter 4 verse 6 and 7, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." As she spoke those words, peace would wash over her, not because the battle was over, but because she knew who was fighting it with her. Trusting that God is in control is not about denying reality or pretending that life's struggles do not exist. It is about acknowledging that while our challenges are real, so is the God who is bigger than them. In Mark chapter 4 verses 37 to 39, we read about the storm that hit while Jesus and his disciples were on a boat. The wind raged, the waves threatened to capsize them, and fear gripped the hearts of the disciples. But where was Jesus? He was asleep. Not because he did not care, but because he knew who held authority over the storm. When he awoke, he simply said, "Peace, be still." And the wind and waves obeyed him. Think about that for a moment. The same Jesus who calmed the storm with a word is the one who stands with you in your storm. When life rages around you, he whispers, "Peace, be still," not just to the circumstances but to your heart. And that peace, my friends, is not something that can be manufactured or bought. It is a gift that comes from trusting that God is in control. There was a season in my life when I felt as if I was standing in the middle of a storm. Every plan I had made seemed to fall apart one by one, and I felt like a ship tossed by the waves. One night, I found myself crying out to God, "Lord, do you see what is happening? Do you care?" It was then that I felt the gentle reminder of Isaiah chapter 41 verse 10, "So do not fear, for I am with you, do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." Those words were like a lifeline thrown to me in the middle of the tempest. I realized that while I was busy looking at the storm, God was holding me in His hand. It did not mean that the storm ended immediately, but it did mean that I was no longer afraid of it. Trust changes our perspective. When we truly believe that God is in control, we stop looking at our circumstances through the lens of fear and start looking at them through the lens of faith. We begin to see that what might look like a setback is really a setup for something greater, that what feels like a delay is actually God's perfect timing. We start to understand that He is not just present when life is good but is sovereign over every season. Job's story is perhaps one of the most powerful examples of trust in the face of unimaginable loss. Job was a man who loved God, a man who was blameless and upright. Yet, in what felt like the blink of an eye, he lost everything, his children, his wealth, and his health. And still, in the depths of his pain, he said in Job chapter 13 verse 15, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him." What kind of trust is that? It is the kind that says, even if I do not understand, even if everything I hold dear is taken from me, I will still trust that God is in control. We cannot talk about trust without mentioning faith. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 1 tells us, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." Trusting that God is in control is having faith that He is working even when our eyes see nothing but darkness. It is the confidence that even in the silence, God is speaking, moving, and preparing a breakthrough that will testify to His power and love. Sometimes, we need to remind ourselves of what God has done in the past to strengthen our trust in the present. King David, a man after God's own heart, often found himself in dangerous and overwhelming situations. Yet, in Psalm chapter 27 verse 13 and 14, he declared, "I remain confident of this, I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living." Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. David's confidence was not in his own strength or abilities, but in the God who had delivered him time and time again. And let me tell you, waiting is one of the hardest parts of trust. Waiting means we are not in control, and that is uncomfortable. But the waiting season is not wasted. It is in the waiting that God refines us, grows us, and prepares us for what is ahead. Remember, Joseph spent years in prison before he saw the fulfillment of God's promise. Moses spent 40 years in the desert before he led the Israelites out of Egypt. Even Jesus waited 30 years before his ministry began. Waiting is where trust is tested and strengthened. A dear friend once shared with me how he had been praying for a breakthrough in his career. Doors that seemed promising would suddenly close, and opportunities he thought were sure things would vanish. Frustration and doubt began to creep in, and he found himself questioning whether God had forgotten him. But one day, while reading Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 11, he felt the words resonate deep within him. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." It was in that moment that he realized that God's plans were bigger than his own. When the breakthrough finally came, it was better than anything he could have imagined, and he saw that the closed doors had been God's way of steering him towards something greater. You may be in a season of waiting right now, feeling as though nothing is happening. But trust that God is working behind the scenes. He is arranging things in your favor, aligning people and circumstances, and preparing you for what is to come. Just as the farmer waits for the seed to grow, trusting that rain and sun will do their part, so must we wait on God, trusting that He will fulfill His promises. Let us not forget that trust also means surrender. It means giving up our need to control, our need to understand, and our need to have all the answers. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11 verse 28, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." When we trust that God is in control, we find rest for our souls. The burden of trying to manage everything on our own falls away, replaced by the peace that comes from knowing that the God who holds the universe also holds us. Trust is not just for the big moments, the life-changing events. It is for the everyday things, too, the decisions, the unknowns, and the small worries that nibble at the edges of our hearts. It is for the times when we are running late and stuck in traffic, when a child's fever will not break, or when a meeting does not go as planned. Trust is a daily choice to say, "God, I may not understand what is happening, but I know that you do." And that is enough. Brothers and sisters, as we walk through this life, let us remember that trusting that God is in control does not mean we will never face difficulties. It does not mean we will not feel fear or doubt. But it does mean that when those moments come, we will have a rock to stand on, an anchor that keeps us steady. We will have the assurance that we are never alone, for the God who promised in Deuteronomy chapter 31 verse 8, "The Lord Himself goes before you and will be with you, He will never leave you nor forsake you," is faithful. As I close this message, I want to leave you with one final thought. Trusting that God is in control is not just an idea, it is a way of life. It is waking up each morning and saying, "Lord, today I choose to trust you." It is facing challenges and declaring, "God, you are greater." It is laying our heads down at night and knowing that while we rest, the one who watches over us neither slumbers nor sleeps. And when we live with that trust, we will find that no matter what comes our way, we will not be shaken, for our hope is in the one who holds all things together. So today, let us rise with hearts full of trust, eyes set on Jesus, and voices ready to declare, "God, you are in control. I trust you, now and always."